Well, hello. So I'm going to start by asking Taso about something that we all know to be true, that every major newspaper and business publication has said is true, that this is the future. The future is hybrid work. Only hybrid work will work going forward. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's a bit of a myopic response because companies that have gone remote have worked so well that that is clearly the path forward. There are companies, and you could probably name most of the Global 2000s, Fortune 500s, that have had to transition to remote very fast and transition back because they weren't prepared to do so. And so they might have the perception now that hybrid is a better solution, but anyone running a remote company, working remotely, or doing any sort of profession that can be done adequately remotely knows that remote work is the future and the best way to work.
100% remote work, nobody in the office, that's what you mean, right?
Yeah, and that's qualified by the statement or the fact that you must be able to do your job remotely. If you look at some companies that have hybrid situations where it requires the software engineer to pair with somebody, let's say, in an automotive situation or in a chemical or biopharmaceutical situation, that is different. But if it's purely about software development, law, or other realms of business professions that can purely be done remotely, remote is absolutely the best way to go.
Okay. And you know this from your own experience at Toptal?
Well, I don't know it just from my own experience. I know it from speaking with other founders who run their own fully remote companies, Matt Mullenweg, who runs Automatic. There are a plethora of companies now that have proven that and have shown that the cost of an office is not outweighed by the efficiencies of remote work and/or otherwise.
Great. Okay. Well, as all of you who read the news probably have read, Elon Musk recently summoned all the people who are doing remote work or hybrid work back to be at least 40 hours a week in the office at Tesla. And he said, for people working remotely, go pretend to be working someplace else. What would you say to that?
I would say he's incentivized to state that so that he doesn't have a divided workforce at Tesla, SpaceX, and SolarCity. These companies are in the category of the dual physical work programming sort of pairing that's needed. The software engineers at Tesla must work with the engineers on the factory floor, on the ground, to be able to make that a reality. The same goes for SpaceX, the same goes for SolarCity. And so it's my belief that he's actually incentivized to say this and that he knows remote work does work, but to state that for all of his companies would be a very controversial, inflammatory statement because he'd be dividing his workforce into the haves and the haves-not.
Right. And do you think that that happens in every hybrid situation, that there's haves and have-nots?
Well, it, again, depends on the type of company. I would think that if you can work remotely and the company allows for it, the dynamics by which you do the work allow for it, then working remotely is certainly the most proficient way of working.
Okay. We've all heard, I don't know if you have, but I certainly have, we've all heard stories of people who supposedly were holding one remote full-time job who turned out to be actually holding two remote full-time jobs. I mean, what do you say to people who say if someone is working remotely, I have no idea what they're doing?
Well, it's about trust and trusting the people to do the job that they are tasked to do. And I will say that in my experience, and I have more than a decade of experience running a fully remote company, Toptal as a workforce is the largest fully distributed company in the world without an office, so a bit more than 7,000 as a workforce, 1,500 insofar as our core team goes, approximately. I haven't seen that too often. Now, maybe our folks are just so effective that they're able to work two jobs all the time and also make the progress that we need them to, but for me, and in my experience, I haven't seen that as a true problem that has affected our perception of remote work or the actual experience of remote work.
Okay. The other thing that people say about remote work, particularly in a company like yours, and as you say, a very large company to be all remote, is that it's very hard to have a company culture or a spirit of camaraderie or all those things that supposedly are so important to have when everyone's together in the workplace. How do you navigate that?
Well, that's a great question. That was actually one of the more difficult elements for me to figure out when starting Toptal and scaling Toptal. Culture, as it really boils down to, is about an alignment of values. It's an alignment of cultural values. It's an alignment of basically principles that allow folks to be on the same page in regards to the company that they're working at. And ideally, those individuals are aligned with the values of the company so that they're in lockstep. Now, when I started Toptal, we didn't have a lot of the different elements that would exist implicitly that you would see in the office. For example, if you're in flip-flops, you sort of have some unspoken assumptions as to what the culture is. Or if you're in a suit and you're on Fifth Avenue, there's another assumption that's sort of in the opposite direction. When you're working remotely, you don't have those assumptions. And so it took me several years to figure out that you don't need to sort of implicitly do anything. You need to explicitly do everything. You need to explicitly state what your values are, live those values, work to make sure that every action that you take and your executive team takes and your SLT team takes is aligned with the values that you state on your website and that you propel are true to your organization.
Okay, but here we're talking about values, which is a little bit different from culture and how people interact. Was there anything explicit that you did to sort of bring people together or get them interacting in a way that is, Toptal style?
Well, after stating our values, which really, to us, was the most important thing that we had to do, we brought folks together on offsites. We cultivated really wonderful relationships and connections through offsites, through different sorts of similar types of interactions. We've had, online wine tastings. We've had different types of virtual events. But really, the in-person ones, ironically, are really some of the best ones for team building and culture building. However, that's where they're good. Working is where that kind of stops. The culture building part is really separated from the everyday work experience. Once you have a really cohesive culture, you can then all break and go remote and work very effectively.
So you create the culture at the on-sites or at the group meetings, and then people go. Somebody that I interviewed yesterday said that it's particularly challenging for young people coming into the workforce for the first time or coming into your company for the first time to get this sort of soft skills culture piece working. Is there any advice you have about that?
Well, younger professionals often don't, including myself when I was starting Toptal, understand what culture is. And so it's difficult to know what culture is if you haven't researched it, haven't really gone deep into building team culture and going to all aspects of what that really is. So it's important that folks who are young in their career research culture, research what it actually boils down to. It's not about, do you have a different work style than someone else, or, do you interact with someone in one way versus another? It really does boil down to, are you aligned on values, and are your actions reflecting the values that you're performing? And so that is sort of the essence of it. And I think everything from there, if you understand that, really becomes implicitly understood.
Great. Okay. Well, we have a few minutes left, so I'd like to take some of that time to talk about Toptal's focus on freelance and contingent work. And there may be some people out there who could possibly be customers of Toptal looking for employment. Why would somebody prefer to look for employment that's freelance or contingent as opposed to the security of a permanent job that could last theoretically forever?
Well, that's a good question. So a show of hands, who would like to double their compensation? Okay, that's pretty much everyone.
Those of you who didn't raise your hands, what's wrong with you?
Maybe there are some well-to-do people here, and we commend you. However, you don't need to double your compensation by just receiving more compensation. you can double your compensation easily by just moving to a place that's half as expensive as where you live. And it's as simple as that. If you Google cost of living New York City versus Buenos Aires, you'll see that the rents are approximately 900% more expensive in New York City than they are in Buenos Aires. Now, of course, when you get to the upper tier, that changes, that diminishes slightly. But if you look at the cost of consumer goods, if you look at all these different metrics, you'll see that it's at least doubly more expensive in New York City than it is in Buenos Aires. And so by just moving and allowing folks to work truly remotely, you're offering them the ability to literally double their compensation. In many cases, depending on the country, triple the compensation if those individuals want to move there. And so it's important to embrace remote work, not just because it's the best way to work, but because it's economically the most sensible way of working.
Right. And what would you say to these companies that are actually reducing people's salaries as they go remote to lower cost areas?
Welcome to Toptal.
There you go. But the other piece of it is that people are maybe getting fully remote jobs, but not necessarily permanent jobs. Why would that be better? Why would you want to take a 6-month assignment as opposed to have a job, supposedly for life?
Well, in the Toptal model, and I don't think we're so unique in this aspect when it comes to long-term remote work. We are as a business because I suppose that's primarily what we focus on, but there are plenty of folks who work remotely who, technically might be a freelancer, but they're working long-term on engagements abroad. And so this term freelancer or contractor gets a little bit muddied in terms of what it actually means. Okay, technically, you might be a freelancer living in Argentina in the example that I just gave, but practically speaking, if you're working for a company for years and years on end, there's really no difference at the end of the day. And so I think that technical distinction perhaps needs to be debated a little bit more in common parlance, but at the end of the day, it really is a long-term type of engagement that is very similar to working full-time in the United States if you're hailing from the United States and having an engagement there.
Great, okay. So we have just a few seconds left. In those last few seconds, I'm going to ask you to predict the future. If hybrid work that all large corporations are turning to now is fundamentally flawed, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think they're all going to call people back to the office? Do you think some of them are going to go all remote?
Well, I think the most salient takeaway from what's going to happen is that the best people are going to leave those jobs and they will join companies like Toptal or other remote companies, maybe even start their own remote companies, because that is what people want. We all know that. And so knowing that is really the roadmap as to what those companies need to do. Otherwise, they'll join Toptal, they'll join other remote companies, and that really is the future.
Great. Thanks. And that's all the time we have. I had fun. I hope you did too. And stick around. There's a lot more going on.
Thank you.